What is going on, Echelon Nation? Ooh, how do you like that name? Should we go with that name? I feel like I'm only using that because, well, John Lee Dumas uses that for his people, for the Fire Nation. But I feel like we do need to come up with some sort of a name. For those of you that don't know, my name is Mark. This is the Echelon Broadcast, and today, what we're going to talk about is producing prolifically. So stay tuned for the broadcast. What's going on? It's Mark with Echelon Media, and today we're going to talk about prolific production and why it's so important. So I have this theory that, well, it's not a theory, it's something I feel that I've lived, and it's that being more analytical and being more of a sort of a more heady mental person, what ends up happening is you live in theory a lot of times. So you read stuff in books. Let's say, for example, something that I'm actually into. Okay, I'm into, and this was like the bane of my existence, skateboarding. Skateboarding, as much as I really, really wanted it to work for me, has always been a big challenge. And even now, at 35 years old, I want to get back to it and really work on getting better at it at some point. And I say this because there was always this disconnect between the reading of the theory and even the watching of the videos, for as good as the videos were and as accessible or inaccessible as they were at the time, about, I don't know, like 15 years ago. What is that, 2000, is it 2008? So it's about 2003? Oh man, I'm so bad at math. But the internet, for what we take it for granted now, was not that good. You couldn't just hop on YouTube and find a video on how to pull off, say, an ollie. Let's go with an ollie. My biggest frustration, the kickflip. I could pop shove it pretty easily, but the kickflip, man, that always it was just the easiest, the most basic, but also the most epic looking thing that you can do, especially if you're just starting off skateboarding, especially if you're that age. And man, that was a bummer. Like, trying to figure out how to kickflip at that age sucked. Especially for me, because for whatever reason, because I was a lot more heady and in my brain, it was difficult to integrate physical tasks. And it really wasn't until I got out of the Air Force that I actually got more into more physical pursuits, I guess I would say. Only because I was forced into having to train for and stay in shape, because we were tested, I believe it was quarterly, but since we had a physical test that we needed to pass, it was imperative that we get it done and that we had to stay healthy, and we had to find things to stay healthy in the interim, in between those exercise tests. And so I got out more and did more stuff, and also it was just like a sort of mid to post high school, me being fat, wanting to get skinny sort of a thing, that I got into more physical activities. But the point being, going from theory, going even from the demonstrations to actually applying it, requires a lot of practice. And this is the reason why I want to touch on prolific production. Coming back from the Air Force, I remember that one of the other things that I've really wanted to pursue is music, because I remember watching this Rage Against the Machine video and just seeing the crowd swell and move, and it was as if it was like magic, like they could just control the crowds with their music. And I wanted that. I wanted that so much. And in the process, I picked up the guitar because I was really super into Tom Morello style. But like with anything, what was frustrating was that understanding the theory was one thing, but actually executing on that theory and being able to get to the levels of, say, a Tom Morello, or let's say like a Stevie Ray Vaughan, it was just a whole different thing. And it's just really, it's rooted, or it comes down to practice. And that's why, though it's sort of a fancy title, when I say that you want to produce prolifically, the only reason why you want to produce prolifically is that it allows you the space to practice. And I think I feel like the inherent problem in that idea of producing prolifically is that it presents it to be so fancy. Like, it makes it sound like this big artistic thing, that what ends up happening is that you think that everything that you do produce, especially in artistic pursuits, has to be the best thing. But the thing is, it doesn't have to be the best thing. It could be as good as it is for where you are at the time, and people could give you feedback, and that feedback will steer you in the direction of where you need to go to better your artistic craft. One of the best things, and I mention this a lot, I mention this when I talk to people a lot, is one of the best things that I ever heard from Trent Reznor is that he said, I think in an interview years ago, he said, somebody was asking him, with the technology that we have now and knowing what you know, would you go back and redo the work that you did in the past? And he said, no, I don't really care to, because that was as good as I can make it at the time. And that's good for where it is and for what it is. And I'm just going to leave it at that. And that I feel is sort of part of the mentality that you need to have on top of this idea of prolifically producing and practicing to better your craft. And I take an even bigger perspective, and I actually see the whole of life as this prolific production of the meaning that I want to get out of it. And I want to draw that back and get away from like the clouds and the headiness of all of that. What I mean by it is that, like, if you were to define your life as, say, a surfer or a skateboarder, or let's say Tom Morello as a guitarist, in order for you to get to the levels where you can be seen as a guitarist and be known and have the notoriety and fame as Tom Morello guitarist, you need to practice to get to the point where people can see you. And people will only ever really take note and see you when you get to such a high level that you're just a god. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but when you see something, when you see like a top level gymnast perform something amazing on the Olympic stage, when you see something like Usain Bolt doing what he does, I mean, fundamentally, Usain Bolt is just running. We all can run, but the amount of time that he spent to refine and perfect that particular activity to the point where he's the fastest man on earth. I don't know if that's necessarily been, if he's been dethroned since, but the fact that he can claim that title means he put in so much effort and time, and that's where most of us think, okay, that's a little bit out of balance. He has no other focus in his life except for this one singular thing. But that's exactly what you need to do in order to better your craft. And ultimately, in the bigger perspective, because I am discussing these topics and sharing them with people who are in business for themselves oftentimes, or trying to build something around their craft as a business or as a way of making a living, you need to refine your craft to get to the point where you are noticeably good so that people will want your service or product. And so it's that I feel, I mean, in my particular case, is extremely critical. And also the reason why there was that special episode that I created talking about David Bond, that I had to actually pay attention to the feedback, because that feedback allows me to understand what the, let's say, market or what the demographic or what the people want to hear. Granted, it's going to still have my particular stuff. It's going to have the basics and fundamentals of what it takes to create a show like this, with a layer of my own style on top of that, and then a layer of what the audience is expecting or wants to see out of that. But it's in taking all of those parts and practicing it over and over through production and creation that you realize ultimately what you want to create. You become better and better at either podcasting or playing the guitar or being Usain Bolt because you've practiced. And in the process of prolific production, you're able to see your pitfalls as well as your as the higher points of what you're capable of achieving. But you really won't be able to do that unless you put in the time to practice. And this is why, like, the first few episodes, admittedly, were probably really crappy by some people's standards. But it was just, I mean, even just the ability to set the space up and to, for example, use a different camera requires an understanding of the limitations of what I was doing before, so that moving forward, I can then go, okay, well, I need a different camera angle. I need to understand that I probably need to speak with a little more energy and be more honest, and yet still cater the messaging enough where it's not so bombastic. And I said this before in a prior podcast as well. I don't want to be too clickbaity, and I don't want to be too sensational. But at the same time, I want to be able to exude and speak on who I am, and to actually express myself as I am, as best as I possibly can, and step into that. And I feel that that's, as we sort of practice, we get better at refining that, and we find a better practice. Ultimately, over time, setting this studio, let's call it, will become second nature. And then little nuances like the lighting can be adjusted. Maybe the cameras I can get higher quality equipment, better equipment to refine the quality of the footage. The colors could be a lot richer and better. All of these things can come into play. But it's not until you prolifically produce and practice the fundamentals that you get to see all the more advanced things. And that's why it's critical to, as I've mentioned before, and a lot of this stuff is speaking to myself. As I mentioned before, it's a lot of it is also learning to humble yourself and say, I suck at this thing. I do not need to reinvent the wheel in terms of podcasting, in terms of presenting myself as a brand. And so it may hurt, and it genuinely is not physically painful, but it is a bit rough to take feedback from people and say, okay, well, hey, like, your stuff sucks, bro, and you need to change it. It does hurt a little bit, but in the long run, and I can even feel it right now. I'm like, I want to say this is about 6 or 7 podcasts episodes in. Let me just adjust this real quick. Yeah, this is about 6 or 7 podcast episodes in. I already feel a lot more comfortable in this space, although, there's still little nuances even in the moment that I can pay attention to. And though I've never been in Usain Bolt's head, I've never been in Stevie Ray Vaughan's head when he's playing guitar, I've never been in Michael Phelps's head when he's swimming, I do feel that since they have an awareness of their body and they know the fundamentals, they can better pay attention to how they can refine their technique to be faster, to be better at playing the guitar, as Stevie Ray Vaughan's case, or in Jimi Hendrix's case may be, or in John Lee Dumas's case. And this is the crux of why I'm doing this, and this is the reason, since this is a podcast, I wanted to discuss this. One of the things that John Lee Dumas wanted to do with Entrepreneurs on Fire is that he actually wanted to be able to practice daily, because he was noticing, as far as the market goes, he was wanting more of this kind of content. He wanted podcasts so that he could feed his brain, but there was just no podcast that did it 7 times a week, all 7 days for 30, 31 days a month. And so what he felt like he needed to do in order to get better was actually produce prolifically and just put it out there. And granted, like anything in life, we're going to suck at the beginning. It just is the case. And I honestly can say that it's easy to hide behind technology. It's easy to hide behind the lighting and the sound and all that other stuff. But at the end of the day, if what you're trying to present is not all that relatable, no one's going to give a shit. And I would hope that this is relatable. I don't know if this is necessarily relatable, but I hope that it at least makes sense, especially if you're an artist, especially if you're a craftsperson, especially if you're an entrepreneur. And speaking of entrepreneurs, there are some interesting stories. For example, like, let's say Colonel Sanders. Colonel Sanders didn't achieve the level of success that he had until a very, very late age because it took a matter of practice for him. And it's not always the perfect practice because maybe he wasn't paying attention to the feedback. If you follow Gary Vaynerchuk, he says all the time that he's very sympathetic and very emphatic to the people that follow him, but at the same time, he doesn't give a shit. Like, he doesn't give a fuck. So on the one hand, he doesn't give a fuck that he's driving towards the goal that he wants, but at the same time, he's also very emphatic and very sympathetic to the feedback that people have because it ultimately tells him what he needs to do to reach a broader audience. And if you're trying to create a business, I think I've mentioned this in the past, if you're trying to create a business, you need to be able to speak to the demands, the needs of the people, because otherwise, I mean, you can create just a commoditized business, but even then, that commodity is only really of value as far as people need it, and if they find value in something else, like for example, videographers, like myself, if they find value in somebody else, then they're not going to give two shits about me. But one way that I know that I can elicit or I can express more value to someone is if they get an opportunity to really see me as I am and as who I am. Whereas if someone is just hiding behind the credentials of I have a 4K camera and I have all this awesome equipment, you're just another commodity. And so if you can get away from that and sort of speak more to who you are, which requires practice actually, trying to express yourself wholly as a person is actually really difficult. And even through this, it's a challenge in itself, and it's part of refining the craft. But in order to do so, you have to produce prolifically. Wow, that time went by really fast. So, again, give me feedback. Let me know if this all makes sense. Let me know if this is actually on track to being more coherent and usable and having more practical examples so that you can better comprehend and understand what I'm talking about. Because I want this to actually be useful for people. So let me know. Give me some feedback. Leave those in the comments on iTunes and leave me 5 stars if you so will, if you enjoyed this. And definitely do take the time to leave the comments if you want a little more information, if something didn't make sense to you. I'm just doing this a lot of times off the cuff. So, I'd have to dig into the content a little bit to understand what it is, or maybe even know what I was talking about. So leave a comment and let me know. And if you happen to be watching this on YouTube, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And also leave a comment as well if you don't understand or if you need more clarification on something. And if you want to see more of this as well as all the other instructional stuff I happen to be putting out there, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and make sure you put on that notification bell so that you can hear the next time I have some content out for you guys. And if you're watching this on Facebook, go ahead and give it a like and share it with friends and people, other artists, other craftspeople, other entrepreneurs, so that they can better understand that in order to really get better at the craft, they need to practice and practice perfectly. I'll touch on that another time. But this has been Mark Kabanig, your host. Thank you so much. We'll play around with the Echelon Nation moniker for a little bit. It sounds nice, but I don't want to bite John Lee Dumas too much on that. I do appreciate his stuff, and you should go check out his content. I think he's gone down to 1 podcast a week because he's gotten a lot of traction, but he's doing really good for himself. Again, thank you so much. I'm going to wrap it up here. My name is Mark with Echelon Media, helping you elevate your story. I will see you next time. Take it easy. Peace.